The note slid silently across the polished table, its message simple but deadly. "You're being watched. Table 6. Don Manzini didn't flinch. He had built an empire from nothing, but in a world where every shadow hides a threat, he knew better than to ignore a warning. Someone was playing a game, and this time they weren't afraid to make their move. The question was, how far was Don Manzini willing to go to protect everything he had? The restaurant was quiet, almost too quiet for a place so bustling with people. A soft hum of chatter floated between the clink of glasses and the rustle of napkins. But amidst it all, one table commanded attention, the one that had always commanded attention. Don Manzini sat at his usual seat, the head of the table, the leader in a world built on loyalty and fear. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room with the quiet authority that made him a figure of reverence and terror. His silver hair was neatly combed back, every inch of his tailored gray suit impeccable, down to the fine stitching of the cufflinks that gleamed faintly under the soft chandelier light. The intricate tattoos that marked his hands, the legacy of his empire, caught the eye of anyone brave enough to study them. But it wasn't his attire, nor the power that radiated from him that made him a legend. It was the fear, the quiet whisper of his name in every corner of the city that turned him into a myth. Beside him sat Serafina, his most trusted advisor and confidant, a woman whose elegance matched the man's own. Her sharp eyes flickered over the crowd, alert to the movements of every person in the room. Her black suit, tailored to perfection, molded her form with a quiet grace. Her dark, glossy hair framed her face, and the way she carried herself suggested she was more than capable of handling whatever came their way. They made a perfect pair, a king and queen in their own domain. As the evening wore on, the two conversed quietly, their voices hushed but purposeful. Manzini leaned forward, listening to Serafina's words, his focus never straying far from his surroundings. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. People who had once dared to cross him were no longer around to tell the tale. But for all his power, there was one thing that still made his heart race: vulnerability. Without warning, a waiter passed their table, a soft movement in the air that disrupted the stillness for just a moment. Manzini glanced up, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The waiter's eyes darted nervously, as though something was wrong. The subtle movement was unnoticed by most, but not by him. He caught the slight tremble in the waiter's hands as a folded note was slid quietly under his glass. Serafina noticed the shift in his demeanor instantly. She followed his gaze, then leaned in just enough to ask in a low voice, "What is it?" Without answering, Don Manzini picked up the note with a slow, deliberate motion, his fingers gripping it just tightly enough to crack it open. As he unfolded the small piece of paper, a flicker of concern passed through his otherwise stone-cold expression. The words were simple, but their meaning was anything but. "You're being watched. Table 6. A cold chill ran down his spine, but he masked it quickly. He folded the note back up, his fingers still steady, and placed it gently back under the glass. He didn't flinch, didn't show even a hint of alarm. But the words had lodged themselves in his mind. "Someone's playing a game," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. Serafina met his gaze, her lips pressing together into a tight line, her instincts telling her this wasn't just a message, it was a warning. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room again, more intensely this time. There, across the room, at table 6, a man sat alone, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He didn't belong here. The way he was sitting, the careful positioning of his hands, suggested he was waiting for something, waiting for someone. Manzini's heart beat a little faster now, but he didn't show it. Instead, he allowed his gaze to flicker over to Serafina. "We need to know who that is." Serafina nodded, already moving. She stood and began making her way to the restroom, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each step purposeful, calculated. She knew the underworld better than most, but this was different. Someone was daring to threaten them, and that was a line that never went uncrossed. Meanwhile, Don Manzini remained seated, the calm at the center of the storm. But beneath that calm, he was already strategizing. Every move mattered now, every glance, every word. He wasn't sure who was behind this, but he had learned long ago not to take threats lightly, and this wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. As Serafina approached the door to the restroom, she couldn't help but look back at the lone man at table 6. Her instincts told her that whoever this was, they weren't just here by chance. Something big was about to unfold, and she had to be ready. As the minutes ticked by, the air in the restaurant grew thicker with tension. Don Manzini sat back, the edges of his lips curling slightly, as though savoring the moment of uncertainty that lingered in the space around him. His mind raced, each calculation a step closer to understanding who was daring to play a game with him. In this world of power and secrets, there was no room for mistakes. And now, someone had crossed a line. The man at table 6 remained still, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses, his every movement measured, controlled. Manzini had watched him long enough to know that he wasn't just a player in this game. He was a piece being moved. Across the room, Serafina emerged from the restroom, her expression unreadable. A subtle change in her gait that told Manzini everything he needed to know. She had found something. Serafina approached their table, her eyes locked onto Manzini's with a look of quiet determination. "It's him," she said, her voice low but steady. Manzini raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. His gaze shifted toward the man at table 6 once more, and a ripple of unease settled deep in his gut. He had a feeling he knew who this was, but he needed to be sure. "Marco Santoro," Serafina added, her words laced with a venom that wasn't typical of her calm demeanor. "He's been moving in the shadows for years, and he's got the kind of connections that could give even you a headache." Manzini took a long, deliberate sip from his glass of whiskey, his fingers steady on the rim. "Santoro," he repeated, tasting the name like it was something foul on his tongue. "So, he's finally made his move." Serafina nodded. "It seems so. And if he's here, then he's got someone watching us. He's always been cautious, but this is different." Manzini's gaze never left the man at table 6. Marco Santoro. The name rang like a distant echo from a past he had long since buried. Years ago, Santoro had been a mere nuisance, a small-time player in a game of giants. But now, it seemed he had managed to climb the ranks, gaining both power and a reputation for being ruthless. If Santoro was involved, it meant someone had taken a calculated risk, and that risk was being made at his expense. As Serafina stood by, watching her boss's every move, Manzini leaned forward, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "We can't let this play out in the open. We need to handle this quietly. There's no room for mistakes." Serafina, as always, understood without needing to be told twice. She gave a curt nod before stepping away, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she disappeared into the crowd. Manzini's eyes remained fixed on Marco Santoro, watching as the man at the other table lifted his glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The slow, almost theatrical way Santoro moved only heightened the tension. He was playing a game, one that Manzini had no intention of losing. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes from across the room, one calm, calculating, and the other cold, unyielding. The unspoken challenge was clear. This wasn't just about a message or a warning anymore. This was a confrontation in the making. But before Manzini could make his next move, the waiter who had slipped the note under his glass returned to their table. He hesitated for a moment, clearly nervous under the weight of Don Manzini's gaze. "Is everything all right, sir?" the waiter asked, his voice strained. Don Manzini didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Everything is fine." But the look he gave the waiter was sharp, enough to freeze anyone else in their tracks. "If anyone else comes near this table, I'll know." The waiter nodded quickly and scurried away, and as he did, Manzini's mind went to work. Marco Santoro was testing him. There was no other explanation. This wasn't just a man who wanted to send a warning. He wanted something far more dangerous. Power. Manzini's grip on the glass tightened, but his face betrayed nothing. No panic. No urgency. Just the quiet demeanor of a man who had spent his life learning how to control not only his empire, but every situation that came his way. Suddenly, the door to the restaurant opened, and the gust of evening air swept in, bringing with it a faint chill. Manzini's eyes flicked briefly to the door, noticing a figure slipping in just as the door closed behind them. It was Serafina, but this time she wasn't alone. She had brought with her another man, tall, with sharp features and an intimidating air. The man's presence radiated power, and for a brief moment it was clear he wasn't just a bodyguard or a member of Manzini's inner circle. He was something else. Manzini's heart skipped a beat as his instincts flared to life. This wasn't just about a note anymore. This was a direct message. Santoro had made his move, and now Manzini had to decide how far he was willing to go to protect everything he had built. Before I continue, kindly hit subscribe, now as the game takes a deadly turn. The air in the restaurant seemed to thicken as Serafina and her companion moved toward Don Manzini's table. The man she had brought with her was no ordinary associate. His tall, imposing frame spoke of someone with a deep, unspoken authority, and the way his eyes scanned the room revealed a dangerous sharpness. This was a man who understood the undercurrents of power better than most. As Serafina sat down next to Don Manzini, the tension around them didn't dissipate. In fact, it only grew. The man who had joined them remained standing for a moment, casting a glance toward Marco Santoro, still sitting at table 6. Santoro didn't react. He merely sipped from his glass, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. But the slight shift in his posture told Manzini everything he needed to know. The game was on, and the stakes were higher than ever. "Who is he?" Manzini asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the quiet murmur of the restaurant. Serafina nodded toward the man standing by their table. "His name is Alessandro Vitale. He's one of Santoro's lieutenants. We've managed to keep tabs on him for years, but now he's playing the game." Manzini finished for her, his eyes narrowing. He could feel the weight of every word they spoke, the silent pressure building between them. Alessandro stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the door that had been left ajar in the wake of his arrival. "Santoro's been making moves for months," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But this is something else. He's trying to push into our territory, Don." Manzini didn't flinch, though his mind churned with possibilities. This was the moment when everything could unravel. Santoro had been testing the waters for months, making strategic moves in the shadows, but now he was growing bold. Too bold. "I want him here," Manzini finally said, his voice a low, controlled whisper. "I want him at this table." Serafina raised an eyebrow. "You think he'll come?" "He'll come," Manzini replied, his gaze piercing. "He knows the rules. He knows the game." There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that no one walked away from a table like this without answering for their actions. No one dared to challenge the godfather of their world without facing the consequences. Alessandro stood still, watching, waiting for a signal. It was clear he knew what was coming. Manzini wasn't known for showing mercy, and tonight, it seemed, there would be none. Meanwhile, Santoro continued to sit at his table, appearing calm, almost too calm. He took another sip of his drink and glanced around the room, his eyes catching the briefest flicker of movement. But before he could react, Serafina stood up. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'll make sure he's in position." Manzini nodded but didn't speak. He trusted Serafina more than anyone, and he knew she was more than capable of handling this delicate situation. The woman was a master of maneuvering people, twisting their will with the same ease that a snake coiled its body. As Serafina moved toward Santoro, Alessandro remained behind, his eyes flicking back and forth between the two tables. He could sense the growing tension, the shift in the air that signaled the beginning of a much bigger battle. Minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. Serafina approached Santoro's table with a calm, almost deliberate air. She stopped just short of his chair, her posture impeccable. She didn't smile, didn't show even the slightest hint of warmth, but her gaze was as sharp as a blade. "Mr. Santoro," she began, her voice smooth, her words calculated. "Don Manzini invites you to join him at his table." Santoro didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked at her, his dark sunglasses still concealing his eyes. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his options, his fingers tapping lightly against the glass of his drink. Then slowly, he lowered the glass to the table and stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, but there was something unsettling in the way he moved. He was no ordinary man, and he wasn't intimidated. "I'll join him," Santoro said quietly, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. Serafina turned without another word and walked back to the table, her heels clicking against the floor. Marco Santoro followed her, his gait purposeful, as though he were walking into the lion's den. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath, the room growing quiet as the two figures approached the table where Don Manzini waited. As Santoro arrived at the table, he paused for a brief moment, looking Manzini up and down, as if taking measure of the man who had ruled the underworld for so long. Don Manzini didn't rise to greet him. He remained seated, his fingers still wrapped around his glass, his gaze unwavering. "You made a bold move, Santoro," Manzini said, his voice low and controlled. "But this isn't a game you want to play with me." Santoro's lips curled into a faint, almost amused smile. "I'm not here for a game, Don Manzini," he replied, his voice smooth but carrying a hint of something that sounded almost like a challenge. "I'm here to make a deal." Don Manzini's eyes narrowed. A deal. The word felt foreign, out of place in a conversation between men like them. Deals weren't made, they were broken. "What kind of deal?" Manzini asked, his voice hardening. Santoro sat down without waiting for an invitation, his posture relaxed, as though he were in control of the situation. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I want a share," he said, his voice low. "A share of the empire. In exchange, I'll give you something that will make all of your enemies disappear." For a brief moment, Don Manzini said nothing. His fingers tightened around his glass, but his expression remained stoic. A share of his empire. The very idea was an affront, a direct insult to the power he had spent his life building. "You think you can come here?" Manzini finally spoke, his voice low and filled with deadly intent. "And take what's mine?" Santoro's smile never faltered. "I'm not taking anything. I'm offering you a way out of the war you've been fighting for years. Think about it, Don Manzini. We could rule together." A tense silence filled the room as both men locked eyes, each daring the other to blink first. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them, their words, their power, and the decisions that would shape their futures. "What do you think Don Manzini will do next? Will he take the offer or show Santoro that some things can never be shared? Let me know in the comments." The silence at the table was deafening. Don Manzini's eyes remained locked onto Marco Santoro, the weight of the words just spoken lingering in the air between them like a heavy fog. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. The room around them, once alive with the low hum of quiet conversations, seemed to fall into an unnatural stillness. Santoro's offer hung in the air, tempting, dangerous. He was offering something Manzini had never considered, a partnership, an alliance in the world he had built alone, a share of his empire. And yet, despite the allure of power, something in Manzini recoiled. To share the throne was not a step he had ever been willing to take. His empire was built on trust, loyalty, and control, things that didn't come easy, and certainly couldn't be divided. Manzini's grip on his glass tightened, the cold rim pressing against his fingers as if grounding him to the reality of the moment. The years of painstaking effort that had gone into building his empire, the countless sacrifices and betrayals, it all flashed before his eyes in an instant. This was not just a negotiation. This was a test of everything he had ever stood for. The thought of handing over a piece of it, of weakening his control, was unimaginable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, though a storm raged inside him. "You're offering me a deal," Manzini began, his gaze never wavering from Santoro's face. "But what you're really offering is betrayal. A partnership in name, but a power play at its core." Santoro didn't flinch. He remained calm, his fingers steepled in front of him, his expression unreadable. "Call it what you want. I'm offering you a way out. You're tired, Don. You've been fighting wars for too long, and your enemies are closing in. What I'm offering is peace. We can wipe the slate clean, start fresh." Manzini chuckled, a dark sound that echoed in the silence of the room. "Peace?" he repeated, his voice tinged with incredulity. "There is no peace in this world, Santoro. Only power, and the ones who are strong enough to take it. And you're not strong enough to take what's mine." For the first time since their conversation began, Santoro's smile faltered, the mask of control slipping ever so slightly. "You think I'm here because I'm weak?" he asked, his voice suddenly low, dangerous. "I've built my own network. I've made my own enemies, and I've done it without your help, Don. But I'm offering you something, an opportunity to grow even stronger, to secure your legacy." Manzini's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, his eyes narrowing slightly. "My legacy is built on blood and fire. It's not something you can buy or trade." Santoro's eyes glinted with something like annoyance, but he hid it quickly. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers still tapping lightly on the table. "So, you choose to fight alone?" he asked, the challenge clear in his voice. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. For a brief moment, Manzini allowed himself to consider it. Fighting alone. It wasn't a new thought, but it had always been the only option. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the sting of weariness creeping into his bones. "Alone?" Manzini repeated, his voice softer this time, though still filled with authority. "I've never fought alone, not for a single moment. But the difference between you and me, Santoro, is that I don't need a partner. I don't need anyone to tell me how to run my empire." Santoro leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you're a fool, Don Manzini." The words hit hard, sharper than any blow, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Manzini's eyes flashed with a cold fury that only those who truly knew him could recognize. He stood slowly, the movement deliberate, each step bringing him closer to Santoro. His towering presence loomed over the younger man, a reminder of the power he wielded. Santoro didn't back down, but his posture tensed ever so slightly. "You don't get to call me a fool," Manzini said, his voice low and controlled, the weight of his words sinking into the space between them. "I built this empire from nothing. Blood, sweat, and sacrifices. And I didn't do it alone. I did it with loyalty, something you know nothing about." Santoro met his gaze, unwavering. "Loyalty," he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "Loyalty is a tool, a weapon. You should know that better than anyone." "And what do you plan to do with this weapon?" Manzini asked, his eyes flashing with a sudden dangerous light. "Destroy everything I've built?" Santoro's smile returned, but this time it was colder, more calculating. "Not destroy, Don, only reshape. The world is changing. You're stuck in the past, clinging to an outdated idea of power. I'm offering you the future, and all you have to do is take it." Manzini looked down at the younger man, his gaze unwavering. For a moment there was silence, each man measuring the other, deciding whether to make the next move. Finally, Don Manzini spoke, his voice like ice. "I don't take what's offered. I take what's mine. And what's mine is everything." The tension that hung in the air seemed to thicken as Marco Santoro sat back, his expression unreadable. The room had gone quiet again, as though holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to break. Manzini, standing tall before him, radiated a quiet intensity that only came from years of survival in a world that ate the weak alive. His eyes were cold, fixed on Santoro, but there was something else behind them now, a trace of something deeper, a growing realization that this wasn't going to be an easy battle. Santoro's smile returned, but it wasn't the same smile as before. This one was sharper, as though he had already moved past the initial disappointment and was now calculating his next move. "You'll regret this, Don Manzini," he said softly, his voice steady. "You've made an enemy of the wrong person." The words felt like a shot fired in a darkened room, reverberating in Manzini's mind long after they had been spoken. He didn't flinch, though. He never flinched. "You've been a thorn in my side for years, Santoro," Manzini said, his voice steady and controlled. "But now, you've crossed a line. And the only way you'll walk out of this room alive is if you remember one thing: no one gets to threaten me and live to tell the tale." Santoro didn't seem intimidated. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment before the inevitable clash. "You think you have the upper hand?" he asked, his tone darkening. "You think you can intimidate me with your threats?" Manzini didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back as he turned his gaze towards Serafina. She had been standing quietly beside him throughout the confrontation, watching the scene unfold with her usual calm demeanor. But now there was something in her eyes, a flicker of concern, just enough to betray the depths of her loyalty to him. "Serafina," Manzini said, his voice low but filled with command. "Make sure no one leaves this restaurant until I say so." Serafina nodded without hesitation, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward the door. She knew the protocol by now, and she knew the stakes. The game was no longer about alliances or deals. It was about survival, about showing who truly held the power. Santoro, still standing in the center of the room, let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can control this, Don Manzini? You think you can shut me down just like that? You've underestimated me. I'm not some small-time player. You should have taken my offer." But Manzini wasn't listening to him anymore. His mind was already racing, calculating the next steps. There was no turning back now. Santoro had drawn his line in the sand, and Manzini would cross it without a second thought. He looked to Alessandro, who had been standing silently behind him, waiting for orders. Without a word, Alessandro moved toward the exit, his presence alone enough to send a message. He didn't need to speak. His silence spoke volumes. The tension in the room thickened, every second stretching out like a wire pulled too tight. The air was thick with anticipation, each man waiting for the other to make the next move, but neither of them willing to show any sign of weakness. Then, with a sudden movement, Manzini took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Santoro. His voice was quiet, but it was filled with deadly intent. "You've made your choice, Santoro," he said, his words low but unmistakable. "Now, you'll live with the consequences." Santoro's expression darkened, but he didn't flinch. "So be it," he said, his voice cold as ice. "But remember this, Don Manzini. You started this war, and I will finish it." Without another word, Santoro turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. The door opened, and for a moment, the outside world seemed to rush in with a gust of cold air, but then it slammed shut again, and all that remained was the tension that had already been set in motion. Manzini watched him go, his expression unreadable, but inside, his mind was already working. The game had changed. Santoro was no longer just a nuisance to be dealt with quietly. He was a direct threat to everything Manzini had built, and in this world, there could be no room for weakness. The restaurant was still, too still. As the door slammed shut behind Marco Santoro, the air in the room seemed to release a collective sigh, as if the entire space had been holding its breath for too long. But the tension didn't dissipate. It only intensified. There was a storm brewing, and Don Manzini could feel it gathering around him. Serafina stood by the door, her sharp eyes never leaving the place where Santoro had exited. She knew better than anyone that when the storm came, it wouldn't just be a flash of violence. It would be a battle of wits. A war fought not with guns and knives, but with manipulation, strategy, and power. Manzini stood by the table, his back straight, his hands still clasped behind him. He was a man who had spent years perfecting the art of control, but even he couldn't deny that this situation was different. Santoro had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Alessandro re-entered the room, his heavy footsteps making their presence known. He closed the door behind him with a quiet finality, and in that moment, the weight of the situation settled around them like a thick fog. "They've been watching us, Don," Alessandro said, his voice grim. "Santoro's people are already in motion. It won't be long before they make their move." Manzini turned slowly, his eyes locking with Alessandro's. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Alessandro replied, his expression tight with urgency. "Santoro has allies, and they don't wait for invitations. They'll be here soon, and when they arrive, they won't just be looking for a fight, they'll be looking for blood." Serafina walked back to the table, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. Her expression was calm, but the fire in her eyes betrayed her thoughts. "We can't afford to wait, Don. We need to act now." Manzini nodded, his mind already working, running through every possible scenario. His empire had been built on calculated risks, and now it was time to make another one. "I won't wait for Santoro to dictate the pace of this," Manzini said, his voice colder than before. "I'll make the first move." Alessandro raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Manzini's eyes flicked toward the window, watching as the soft glow of streetlights illuminated the quiet streets outside. "I'll make Santoro believe he's got the upper hand. I'll give him a taste of what he thinks he wants." Serafina looked puzzled for a moment, but then understood. "You'll bait him," she said, the realization dawning in her eyes. "Make him believe he's in control, and then strike when he least expects it." Manzini's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Exactly. He wants to challenge me. He wants to see if I'll back down. I'll show him exactly what happens when you try to play the game of power against me." As he spoke, the sound of a car engine revving outside caught his attention. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, signaling the arrival of the first wave of Santoro's men. The storm was coming faster than expected. "I need eyes on the streets," Manzini ordered, his tone decisive. "Alessandro, take a team and secure the perimeter. No one gets in without our say-so." Alessandro nodded and turned to leave, his demeanor focused and professional. He had been in situations like this before, but it was clear that even he understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Serafina moved to the side, her hand on her phone as she began making calls to their network. She was already coordinating their response, gathering their forces and preparing for the inevitable. Manzini stood by the table, alone for a moment, his thoughts turning inward. For a brief moment, his mind wandered back to his early days in the business, before the empire, before the loyalty, before the weight of responsibility had crushed the joy out of him. Back when he had been just another player in the game, trying to carve out his own space in the world. But those days were long gone. Now, the empire he had built was more than just a business. It was a fortress that had withstood countless storms, and this one would be no different. He would fight back. He had to. There was no other choice. The door opened, and Alessandro returned, his expression grim. "They're here, Don. Santoro's men are on the move. They're trying to get inside." "Let them try," Manzini said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "They'll find that the door is locked." "And I hold the key." Serafina walked back over to the table, her phone still in hand. "We've secured the perimeter. No one's getting in without our permission." Manzini nodded, a cold smile playing on his lips. "Good. Now, we wait." The waiting game began, the minutes stretching into hours. The tension was palpable, the weight of what was to come hanging over them like a dark cloud. Outside, the sounds of movement began to increase, footsteps, car doors slamming, whispers in the shadows. Santoro's men were closing in. But Don Manzini wasn't worried. He had spent his life mastering the art of control, and now he would show the world just how far his reach extended. Santoro had made a mistake by underestimating him, and now he would pay for it. As the final moments ticked by, the door to the restaurant opened once more, and the soft sound of footsteps echoed through the stillness. Serafina turned toward the door, her eyes narrowing. "It's time." The door opened with a soft creak, a sign of the tension that filled the air. Every eye in the room snapped toward the entrance, where the shadows of Santoro's men stood just beyond the threshold. They had arrived, and the final act of this twisted game was about to unfold. But it wasn't the sound of the door that drew Manzini's attention, it was the silence that followed. The quiet that had settled in the room was unnatural, thick with anticipation. Even the men who had entered with Santoro moved with a calculated grace, their eyes scanning the room, alert to every shift in the air. Manzini stood, his posture commanding, his eyes steady on the man who had just entered, the one who had been behind the movement, the one who had dared to make this challenge. Marco Santoro. Santoro stepped into the room slowly, his every movement deliberate, as if savoring the moment. His sunglasses were gone now, revealing sharp, calculating eyes that betrayed nothing but a cold hunger for control. He looked around the room with a cool, assessing gaze, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though he was sizing up his opponent. "Don Manzini," Santoro's voice rang out, low and smooth. "I came here for peace, but it seems you've made it clear you'd rather fight." Manzini didn't move. He didn't flinch. His eyes never left Santoro's face. "You should have taken the deal," Manzini replied, his voice cold, his words measured. "But you chose to play your hand. Now you have to live with the consequences." Santoro's smile didn't falter. "I'm not afraid of consequences. I've been living with them my whole life. But tell me, Don Manzini, are you afraid? Afraid of what happens when the world changes, when people like me start taking what's ours?" Manzini took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze never leaving Santoro's. "You're mistaken, Santoro. You think this is a game, but it's not. It's a war, and in war, there are only winners and losers." Santoro's eyes flashed with something darker, a flicker of anger that was quickly hidden. He had expected Manzini to back down, to retreat under the weight of his words, but instead the Godfather stood his ground, unwavering. "Do you really think you can stop me?" Santoro asked, his voice hardening. "You're old, Don. You've had your time. The world is changing, and I—" "Enough," Manzini interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I don't need to hear your speeches, Santoro. I've heard them all before. You came here to take what's mine, but you won't. Not today." With that, the room seemed to exhale, the stillness broken by the sudden movement of Alessandro, who stepped forward and placed a hand on the table, his presence filling the space. He was more than just muscle. He was a part of Manzini's strategy. And right now, his presence was a reminder that this wasn't just about power. It was about control, a game that Manzini had played and won time and time again. Santoro's men flanked him, their eyes shifting toward Manzini's men. waiting for the signal to move. But there was no need for it. The tension had already reached its peak, and the first move had already been made. "You've already lost, Santoro," Manzini said, his voice calm but final. "You just don't know it yet." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a statement of fact, and as they did, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The fear that had once been there was gone, replaced by the undeniable confidence that only a man who knew the true cost of power could exude. Manzini had built an empire, not on fear, but on trust, loyalty, and the understanding that control was something you took, not something you waited for. Santoro's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward his men, then back to Manzini. He had underestimated the man before him, underestimated how deep his power ran. He had thought this was a simple game, a power grab. But it wasn't. It was a war, and Santoro had walked into a battlefield he wasn't ready for. "I told you," Manzini said, his voice low but carrying a weight that left no room for doubt. "I don't share power. Not with you, not with anyone." Santoro remained still for a moment, the quiet hum of the room swirling around them. Then, with a subtle movement, he signaled his men to step back. The challenge was over, for now, but the war was far from won. "I'll be back, Don," Santoro said, his voice filled with quiet venom. "And when I return, you won't be in control anymore. You'll see." With that, Santoro turned, his men following closely behind him as they exited the room. The door closed behind them with a finality that reverberated through the room. Manzini didn't move for a long time. He stood, looking at the door that had just closed, his thoughts racing. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Santoro had made his move, but he had underestimated the one thing that mattered most in this world: loyalty. Turning to Serafina, who stood silently by his side, Manzini spoke, his voice calm, but with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "Prepare. The war is only just beginning." Do you think Santoro will truly be able to take control, or will he underestimate the loyalty that holds Manzini's empire together? The real battle is only beginning. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now to stay updated on this high-stakes game of power and loyalty.